Let's have a look at a bit of chronicle first, though, from 1301. So in January, the nobles were summoned to a parliament at Lincoln, where the barons complained of the robberies and other injuries done on all sides by the king's servants. At last, the renewals of Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest were issued, and the king put his seal to them, and they were carried to every county of England. In the same parliament, the king bestowed the Principality of Wales and the earldom of Chester on his son Edward. It was the first time that the king's eldest son had received the title of Prince of Wales. Then the king and the magnates, acting as one, composed a fine letter to Pope Boniface VIII, sealed with 100 seals, beseeching him to protect the right that the English had always enjoyed in the kingdom of Scotland, and to disregard the false claims of the Scots. A dispute broke out between Philip IV, King of France, and Pope Boniface VIII, each of whom was sure of his own powers. For the Pope told the envoy of the King of France, "We have power of both kinds, spiritual and secular." The other replied on behalf of his master, "Indeed, my lord, but yours is in words and ours is real." Immediately Boniface VIII's wrath was kindled, and he swore that he would move heaven and earth against the King of France. And it was the King of France who came off best. His followers later sacked the papal palace at Anagni. So the death of Pope Nicholas IV in 1292 was followed by an election conclave held at Rome, and then Perugia, which lasted an astonishing 27 months. The cardinals who supported the candidate of the powerful Roman Colonna family battled with those who favoured the interests of the masterful Charles II, King of Naples, and the King of France, Philip IV, his second cousin. Neither faction gained the upper hand, and in 1268-71, when a conclave had been similarly undecided, the cardinals had been locked in the papal palace at Viterbo by the citizens and threatened with starvation. In 1294, however, such measures were avoided by the choice of a compromise candidate, the renowned but eccentric octogenarian hermit Pietro Morone. Famed as a healer, ascetic, and organizer of monks, Pietro was living in a secluded grotto on Mount Morone in the Kingdom of Naples, and accepted the papal office with extreme reluctance. As Pope Celestine V, his acts were naive, confused, and highly favourable to King Charles II of Naples. And elected in July 1294, he abdicated in December, largely on the advice of Cardinal Benedetto Gaetani, who was chosen as his successor almost immediately, and took the name of Boniface VIII. Celestine longed to return to his mountain retreat, but Boniface, fearing a schism, kept him in captivity, and when the old man carried out a daring escape, he was recaptured and strictly confined. When he died in prison in 1296, rumours of foul play by Boniface began to circulate. Poor guy, just wanted to be alone in the mountains. I can feel that. Boniface VIII was the antithesis of Celestine, a master, full, impulsive, but highly sophisticated administrator whose ambition was to dominate the political life of Western Europe. He soon came into conflict with the kings of France and England over papal government, taxation, and justice. In 1296, he tried to prevent Philip IV of France from raising money from the church to finance his military campaigns. Philip, however, forbade the export of any money from France, thus greatly depleting the papal coffers. Boniface capitulated in 1297. Despite the setback, he staged triumphal celebrations to mark the year 1300. One of his most celebrated proclamations was that it is necessary for salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff. This was issued in 1302 at the height of the second great dispute with Philip IV about the extent of papal authority in France. Philip's advisers circulated lurid, obscene, and fantastic allegations about the Pope, that he was a sodomite, he had silver images of himself erected in churches, had a private demon as a counsellor. In September 1303, Philip IV's adviser William de Nogaret and Sierra Colonna, at the head of a band of mercenaries, stormed and sacked the papal palace at Anagni. Terrified, Boniface fled to Rome and died shortly afterwards. Boniface's weak and short-lived successor, Benedict XI, was conciliatory towards the King of France, while the former Archbishop of Bordeaux, who became Clement V, was virtually Philip IV's puppet. Racked by ill health and terrified of the resurgent Colonna family in Rome, in 1309 Clement settled with the papal court at Avignon, just outside the borders of France. And although his successors planned to return to Italy, the Curia remained at Avignon almost continuously until 1403. cathedrals like Papal Palace still dominates the city. So here we have on the left Boniface's statue in the Duomo at Florence, which can easily be seen that of a Roman emperor. Yes, that does give strong Roman emperor vibes. Yes, outplaying himself there perhaps, but not all papal images were imperious. This delightful bust in Exeter Cathedral shows a pleasanter face, but with the painted green gloves that are now faded, that were among the accepted symbols of papal authority. And the papal battle remained to plague Christendom for many centuries. Elections were a source of constant argument and dispute for the medieval period, and although many cities claimed the papal seat at different times, Avignon's probably the best known. So this charming image of two men walking in the grounds of a decoratively towered and beflagged citadel shows how the entire town was thought of as a fortress. From 1309 to 1378 it was a papal see, separate from the surrounding countryside. In 1348 the entire city was brought by Pope Clement, although nominally governed by papal legates, and more or less governed itself until a plebiscite in 1741 when the citizens voted to join the French nation. Surprisingly recently. Here we have the very famous poet, of course, Dante. But let's have a look at a chronicle first. So in 1303, on the 31st of May, the much longed for peace between the kingdoms was published, first in France and then in England. Accordingly, Gascony was restored to the King of England with all the rights and liberties that it enjoyed there in 1294 before war broke out. That year, Edward I, King of England, triumphant over the attacks of his enemies, invaded Scotland to punish the insolence of the Scots who'd strained shamefully for their allegiance to him when they'd killed his liegemen, whom he had sent there to keep the king's peace. While these events were taking place in Scotland on the 7th of September, at the very same time that Pope Boniface was robbed in the city of Anagni in Campania, King Edward's treasury in England was robbed by a single thief. Pope Boniface VIII died on the 12th of October and was buried the next day in St. Peter's Church in Rome, in a magnificent tomb he prepared for himself while still alive. The day after he had been buried, the cardinals met and elected the Bishop of Ostia, a Dominican friar, who was consecrated Pope 10 days later and called Benedict XI. That year, King Edward I spent the winter in Scotland at Dunfermline Abbey, and miraculously, just as David was when surrounded by the Ziphites, he was neither harmed by the Scots nor betrayed. So we have here Dante, who can be recognised in this painting by his crown of laurel leaves and the book of poetry in his hand. He's pictured standing in the centre of his beloved Florence. The cathedral is there on the right. The Divine Comedy has inspired artists of every nationality who have reinterpreted Dante's vision of hell and paradise. So certain events in the lives of most major artists seem to give a new impetus to their intellectual and creative development. For Dante, this occurred in late 1301 when he was exiled from his beloved Florence. His banishment was directly linked to the defeat of the White Guelphs, the political grouping with which Dante was aligned, by their opponents within the city, the Black Guelphs, who had engineered a seizure of power with the help of the papacy and the French prince Charles of Valois, the third son of Philip the Fair of France. The victory of the Blacks, which brought to a close a long period of internal strife in Florence, but also curtailed its freedom as an independent city-state, was decisive. Dante was never again to return to his native land. For the next 20 years, until his death in 1321, he was often on the move, finding shelter in a number of cities and courts without substance, that he wandered as far as Oxford. Dante was born in 1265 into a well-established noble family, and by his early 20s had proved himself a writer of note, developing together with other young poets a novel kind of love lyric, the sweet new style, which emphasized in a highly refined language the spiritual qualities and internal effects of love. The supreme achievement of this poetic movement was Dante's own Vita Nuova, written in Florence, which, in stylized poetry and prose, recounted the exemplary story of his love for Beatrice. It doesn't ultimately matter whether Dante's account's based on fact or whether Beatrice is the Beatrice Pontinari of history. Rather, the work's important because it took the medieval European courtly love tradition in radically new directions, and most significantly, it established for the first time how prodigious were Dante's artistic gifts. So although his exile was a great personal tragedy, it was fundamental in broadening after death. Human beings, in their turn, had a duty to ensure they did not offend against God's will. Sin, which they found so attractive, was an ungrateful attack against his divine process. However, according to Dante, God in his kindness had established two universal authorities on earth, each with its own clearly marked sphere of responsibility, to help humanity keep away from sin, the papacy to look after its spiritual needs, and the empire to dispense justice and to maintain peace between different groups and geopolitical entities. In his day, Dante argued that this divine scheme was under particular threat, since popes involved themselves in secular matters and few heeded imperial authority. Instead, like Boniface VIII in his conflicts with Philip the Fair, they were driven only by personal greed. The Divine Comedy should be read against the view of history. This view of history, it purports to be the true account of a journey Dante made in the spring of 1300 through the three regions of the afterlife: hell, purgatory, and paradise, after which the poem's three principal parts are named. Dante further claimed that his journey had a precise reason. In the light of contemporary corruption, God had chosen him, like the prophets of old, to act as one of his messengers. By recounting all that he had seen and learned in the afterlife, Dante was to remind humanity of its responsibilities towards the divine, stressing in particular that our condition after death, eternal suffering or glory, was the direct result of our earthly lives. Real people and historical events, and ultimately the whole of creation, was considered in relation to what Dante claimed to be God's providential plan of history. Although the Divine Comedy can be considered a magnificent synthesis of life and ideas in the Middle Ages, its true importance, as with the Vita Nuova, lies in its poetry. To depict the whole of reality, Dante invented a flexible and linguistically all-inclusive style, which could deal with things as diverse as obscenity and theology, and in doing this challenged the view that particular topics should be treated in appropriate established styles. The stylistic and thematic breadth of Dante's poem calls into question and transcends such artificial boundaries. Its modernity is one of the reasons why it carries through to today, of course. Here we have quite a bit of chronicle here, so let's go over to 1305. So on the 25th of March, King Edward I and his magnates assembled at Westminster to give thanks to God and St. Edward the Confessor for the king's triumph over the Scots. Around the same time, an inquiry was proclaimed by writ, which was trail baston in English. It was designed to deal with those who encroach on the land of others, and then, fearing their complaints, dispose of the land or goods to someone more powerful. Numerous justices were appointed to act upon this writ throughout England, and so strictly did this punishment proceed that a father would not spare his own son, but chastise him reprovingly. Many went into voluntary exile, so great was their fear, and through flight and fines the treasury grew richer. In early August, that Scot William Wallace, a runaway from righteousness, a robber, a committer of sacrilege, an arsonist and a murderer, more cruel than Herod and more debauched in his insanity than Nero. Say what you mean, why don't you? Gathered an army of Scots against the King of England at Falkirk. Seeing that he couldn't resist so strong an army as that of the English, he said to the Scots, "See, I brought you to the ring, now hop or skip as best you can." Then he fled from the field, leaving his people to perish by the sword. In time, this man of Belial was captured by Edward's men after committing innumerable outrages and was brought to London for trial, for the king wished to judge him in person. On the 23rd of August, William Wallace was condemned by the nobles of England to die a most cruel yet fully deserved death. He was dragged through the streets of London, attached to horses' tails as far as a very high gibbet built especially for him. He was hanged in a noose and then cut down when semi-conscious. His genitals were cut off, entrails gouged out and burnt in a fire. Finally, he was beheaded and his body cut into four. His head was impaled on a stake on London Bridge, and his quartered limbs conveyed to parts of Scotland. See the end of a merciless man, mercilessly punished. I mean, yeah, that is kind of brutal, wasn't it? To have your life ended in that way. And on the 15th of September, a royal council was convened at the new temple, attended by bishops, earls and barons, Scottish as well as English, and for 20 days they deliberated over the pact to be made with the King of Scotland, how it could be made better, firmer and deeper, from the point of view of the Scots as well as the English, and how perfect peace and most excellent tranquillity could be well established in perpetuity. By the decree and assent of both sides, justicars and clerks were deputized to act by both north and south of the forth to keep the peace in their native regions, decide lawsuits and settle fights. Then the Scottish bishops, abbots, earls and barons swore for themselves and their heirs and for all in Scotland, now and in the future, to abide by the agreement. This was sworn on the body of Christ, the Gospels and the relics at the manor of Sheen by the River Thames. So much death and suffering in these wars, but we now have rising living standards, which is nice. Here we have the first glass mirrors appearing in 1278 to 81, which was a marked improvement on the polished metal mirrors in use until then. And a beautiful 14th century French ivory mirror case, that is wonderful. Look at the detail. So in England, the 13th century was an age of expansion in population, wealth and education, and the aristocracy lived in a magnificent style unknown since the Roman times. The barn-like halls of the 12th century gave way to mansions with numerous private chambers added to the upper end of the hall, closed to all but the lord, his wife and children, considered necessary to keep followers and servants at a distance. Concessions inside the houses were no longer Spartan. Furniture was sparse, though, because most people still travelled extensively. Where the walls were plastered and pine or painted. Henry III favoured a colour scheme of green spangled with gold stars. That's nice. Hangings and murals lent dignity to private chambers. Floors of the Lord's days and chambers were often tiled. Other areas covered with mats or rushes. So yeah, furniture was sparse, partly because most people still travelled extensively, touring their estates or following the court. The bed was the chief item of furniture. A feather mattress and pillows supported on boards or thongs, and sheets and pillow slips made up of fine linen, and coverlets of thick wool, sometimes fur-lined heavy silk. The hall's great table was polished, the carpet replaced by a fine white cloth set with a glittering display of plate-gilded silver cups, and the wealthy adorned themselves lavishly with rings, gold chains and gems, so much so that there was a private language of precious stones among the educated. The juniper was a token for faith, and the carbuncle for suffering, and so on. An annual gift of a set of robes was part of a retainer's wages, and great men like the Earls of Chester and Lincoln employed master tailors to buy and work the large quantities of cloth their households needed. Very, very fancy. In 1297, Edward's daughters gave him a dressing case for Christmas, a leather box containing a comb, a mirror and a bodkin. So mirrors entering the scene as well, as hygiene was entering the equation. Kingship and chivalry. These are the kind of things we associate with the Middle Ages, aren't they? So outside the battle, knights won honour and practiced their skills by taking part in tournaments, and here a knight is richly dressed and armed for battle. So, described as the best jouster in the whole world, Edward I won this reputation during the turbulent years of his youth in tournaments and on crusade. When he became king, he discouraged mock battles which might distract his followers from the serious business of warfare, but turned this perception of him into good political account. Contemporary enthusiasm for chivalrous codes and practices was given a focus in glittering ceremonies at the royal court, where the cult of chivalry merged with and enhanced the image of monarchy. King Arthur, a hero of the age, was associated with the Plantagenet successor in a number of well-publicised royal ceremonies. In 1278, at Glastonbury Abbey, the supposed tombs of Arthur and Queen Guinevere were opened in the presence of Edward, his queen, and a host of English and foreign dignitaries. The royal bones were disinterred and reburied with full pomp. In 1238, when Edward returned from his conquest of Wales, he brought many relics with him, including part of the True Cross and, equally important, King Arthur's crown, which was said to transfer the glory of the Welsh to the English. The next year, in 1284, the king celebrated the birth of his son, the future Edward II, with a great round table at Carnarvon. Ceremonies, tournaments, singing, dancing and feasting lasted for more than a week and drew its inspiration from Arthurian legends. The best documented chivalrous ceremony of Edward's reign took place in 1306, when he prepared for his last Scottish campaign by knighting some 300 young men, including his son Edward. Part his motives were practical. He needed the fighting men and the money the exercise would produce. Tax raised for the knighting of the king's eldest son was particularly lucrative. However, However, the event was also intended to be a great spectacle, so the young men, all nobles and knights, were magnificently apparelled at royal expense before keeping an overnight vigil in Westminster Abbey and other churches, after which Prince Edward, himself only just knighted, girded on their swords. These had been blessed as a sign of sacramental nature of knighthood. Dubbing, however, was the crucial part of the ritual. A blow with the flat of the hand, it could be and often was performed in haste on the battlefield. There was a huge banquet at the end, roast swans decorated with gold nests and gilded reeds forming the centrepiece. The birds were much prized as food, belonged exclusively to the king, and Edward swore by them as well as God that he would avenge himself upon the scone. So here we have the common tongue. Above earthworks really are all that remains of Braybrook Castle, when Lollards first issued standardised sermons in English. So in 1290, Edward I proclaimed that the King of France in his malice wished to eradicate the English language. This implied that the common tongue was a mark of nationhood, but took no account of the variations of the language from region to region. So at the beginning of the 13th century, the Suffolk congregation of Abbot Sampson of Bury St Edmunds could barely understand the sermons he delivered in his Norfolk dialect. During the late 14th century, southern sailors shipwrecked on the Northumbrian coast were murdered because when they asked in English for food, they were thought to be Frenchmen. The 14th century writer John Trevisa suggested a reason for these problems because they stemmed from three different Germanic tribes. The English had three manners of speech. Subsequent confusion arose from intermingling with Scandinavian and Normans, leading to strange garbling and chattering. Midlanders could understand both northerners and southerners who were incomprehensible to each other. So in the post-conquest period, English was the language of common speech and French was used for administration and for polite and literate conversation. The displacement of Anglo-Saxon, the formalised language of the kings of Wessex as an instrument of government, allowed regional dialects, never suppressed as spoken tongues, to re-emerge in written form. This is really interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, if we went back in time now, we would barely be able to converse with people from our own nation. They wouldn't understand us and we'd barely understand them, right? There's no indication of class accent in the late medieval period, though. Differences in speech were regional rather than social. A northern or west country lord might normally speak French, but when he did speak English, it would be the dialect of his region. So English was the subject to many external influences. The words of French origin recorded by Chaucer were not invented by him, but to reflect the assimilation of the French language into the London dialect of the metropolitan class to which he belonged. As English re-emerged as a respectable language, it was also necessary to supply missing words. Ecclesiastical terms such as procession and pilgrim had long since been introduced by the Norman priests, but by the 14th century there was a need to create an English terminology of law, government, the battlefield and the arts. The same would come to have different meanings depending on whether its roots were in Norman or Central Literary French. Then a distinction between Norman cattle and canal and the French chattel and channel, words such as knife, root, and the pronoun they were the result of Norse influence on the north and east of England, while trading contacts with the Low Countries introduced terms such as booze and skipper. On the borders of the region's dialects blended with the most useful words passed from one to another, gradually spreading across the country. Travelling friars preaching across the length and breadth of England were important agents in the process. Committed to expanding the religious ideals of Western Christianity in the language of the people, they took each dialect and the most suitable words for expressing metaphysical concepts. So, yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? How language can, religion was needed to spread language. Here we come to the end, the death of the leopard. So here we have a chronicle here, the metrical chronicle of Peter Langtoft, written in French, which includes a vivid epitaph to Edward I. King Edward was the flower of Christendom. He was so handsome and great, so powerful in arms, that of him may one speak as long as the world lasts, for he had no equal as a knight in armour. present nor future, we have of him news dolorous and hard. Death has taken him. Alas, henceforth who will do justice upon John Comyn of Badenoch, except him who has the care? Edward, the son of Edward, king of the tenure which is held by vow to destroy King Robert, in the year just named as we have heard, the 7th day of July, for truth we certify you that our King Edward, whose soul may God bless, at Berg by Sands on his way to Scotland, in true faith has ended his life. Now after his death was made public, the body is transported by barons and by clergy to Waltham near London, his own abbey. Waltham Abbey's right near me. For 4 months entire, served with solemn service, it lay embalmed on the bier without sparring of wealth, distributing to the poor who pray for that soul. 34 years, 8 months and 5 days, I tell you. He reigned over England by established law, by reason and right he maintained the monarchy. Of vigour and worth and full of understanding, he had no equal in ruling a lordship. Beside his kindred, now is the body buried at Westminster in tomb of marble well polished. May the prince who for us was punished under Perlet receive King Edward into his mercy, give remission to his soul of the sins committed in his life, take him to his company there into regal mansion, where there is no service except joy and melody. So in the last decade of his reign, this says here, the hammer of the Scots, and that's a bust of him at the top of Winchelsea Cathedral. So in the last decade of his reign, Edward I's remarkable successes in war and government began to turn sour. His constant and voracious demands for money and need for his wars in France and Scotland produced strong baronial opposition. In 1297, the king averted a major political crisis only by abolishing the most detested tax, the maltote, the levy on wool. Other concessions followed. 1298, a major inquiry into administrative malpractices was set up, and in 1300, the king, as a result, agreed in the Articuli Supercarta to put limits on the foodstuffs and supplies that could be taken for his army. The forest boundaries, which the king's administration had taken every opportunity to expand, were another major grievance, and in 1301 Parliament agreed a subsidy only in return for a careful review and return to ancient limits. Subsequently, from 1303 until his death in 1307, Edward levied taxation more cautiously and borrowed immense sums of money, probably totaling some £200,000 from Italian bankers to finance his continuing wars. His position in Scotland began to improve. By 1305, it seemed that he had finally conquered that kingdom, and the same year a former clerk of his, Bertrand de God, was elected Pope, taking the name of Clement V. Almost immediately in 1306, the new pontiff obligingly released Edward from his promises to Parliament over the forests and suspended Robert Winchelsea, Archbishop of Canterbury, and at that stage the king's principal opponent, from office. The king also managed to defend his treasurer, Walter Langton, from the attacks of the barons. Langton was corrupt and ruthless, but the king valued the way in which he had reconstructed the royal administration after the setbacks of the 1290s, and he retained Edward's favour to the end. On July the 7th, 1307, Edward I died at Berg by Sands on his way to fight the Scots once more. One chronicler suggested that his last wish was for the flesh to be boiled away from his bones so that they could be carried with the army on every expedition into Scotland. Another said that he asked for his heart to be buried in the Holy Land, but neither wish was to be fulfilled, for Edward was taken to Westminster Abbey, his family mausoleum, for burial. It's ironic that this king, who is with his construction of highly lavish decorated family tombs and memorial crosses for his wife Eleanor, and had such a marked interest in death, was himself laid to rest in just a plain sepulchre. So that brings us to the end of the life of Edward I, and next up we have Edward II. So I look forward to having you join me next time for this exploration. Until then, goodbye.